Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you very much for having me here. It's really great to be in Australia for my second time. And I'm kind of off the plane, so if I wouldn't make much sense, it's partially because of that. Discussing a little bit with some of you about the content of the talk, and because we're in the framework of a curatorial workshop and in the framework of a program that looks at curating and at research methods behind curating, I will switch a little bit the talk and start with the journal of the plague year and go more in depth about it, because it's more of an example of very much of research-led curating, and then discuss 10 Million Rooms of Yearning, the most recent exhibition that is actually still on view at Parasite. So the exhibition took place that I mentioned took place originally at Parasite and at several other venues in Hong Kong last year. So in 2013, opening in May. It is now actually in a part of a touring situation. It is now actually on view at the Cube project space in Taipei. So if you manage to go to Taipei until I think the second week of August, you would still have the chance to see it. And then it will open at Arco Art Center in Seoul in Korea on the 30th of August and run until the end of November. And then it will be at Cadiz and other venues in San Francisco next April and May. The exhibition was co-curated with Inti Guerrero, who is also my partner. So I think some of that, my life partner. So I think that personal connection that, I guess sometimes can be problematic, fed in many ways into the show somehow, and into sort of like articulating the research. And I think that's a kind of component that, rather than shying away from, is important to actually state. It's important because the show was very much about the city of Hong Kong, and it's the kind of attempt to understand the city and understand different layers of its contemporary position through a curatorial process of writing a new periodization for the contemporary condition of the city. We are both, recent immigrants to the city, so to say. So that position of an outsider also contributes to, and it's another important layer of positioning in the very grammar of the exhibition, because the subject matter was to such a large extent about dealing with the identity of who is in fact a Hong Konger and who is entitled to claim this position and who is entitled to speak for and on behalf of the city. Now, this being the case, it was very clear for us that we wanted to translate both this personal experience of having recently arrived to a city and of trying to understand for personal reasons, like what the kind of like structure of the city is and how can we position ourselves and how can we relate ourselves to the city. And in this process, there was a great deal of discussions and a great deal of attempts to understand what were the kind of like leading moments, key moments, turning points in the recent history of the city that would help us understand how the city unfolds itself. And of course, Hong Kong, more than many other places, has a very obvious date for that. In recent history that, marks fundamentally the history of the city, and that is 1997, the year in which the city, in the year of the handover of the city to mainland China. However, trying to understand all the histories and implications behind that moment, we arrived at a different year that, while being acknowledged as a crucial year in many ways for the history of the city, is less often considered to be such a turning point as 1997, and that was 2003. The year in which a number of events happened simultaneously and to a certain extent being influenced and determined but sort of like mutually. One of these events was the SARS crisis. So let's say the most recognizable, also international occurrence of that year. I'm sure that all of you were familiar with it in real time. It's an epidemic that first was acknowledged as such in the city of Hong Kong. In March 2003, it spread in the next weeks to many other parts of the world, especially Canada, Singapore, and Taiwan were particularly affected, and several thousand people died in the course of 3 months. It wasn't a particularly deadly epidemic, but it's utter novelty, like in terms of like the virus being behind it, and in terms of the entire medical community being unaware of the scale of the impact that this disease could have to the world. The kind of panic and fear about the effects of the disease was quite unprecedented in the modern era, and this effect was especially strong for Hong Kong, which was under relative close down and quarantine for 2 months at the height of the epidemics. So it was really a very particular situation where a modern metropolis is subjected to this, I would say, like primary biological fear of being completely overtaken by an epidemic. At the very height of the fear caused by SARS, there was another event that, less so internationally, but in Hong Kong, was also acknowledged as a very shocking and a sort of like turning point moment in the conscience of the city, and it was the suicide of the pop icon actor and singer Leslie Chung. You can see him on the right side. It was it was an unexpected death, and it was a very theatrical in the way in which it happened. He threw himself off from the top floor of the Mandarin Oriental, the central, and quite an iconic hotel as well, in the center of Hong Kong. Now, I will discuss later when I go there, like why it is important for us to, why it was important for us to bring this episode in the narrative of the exhibition as well, and why we think it's actually like so relevant for the actual implications that we looked at through this exhibition. Yeah, so I'll do that later. Now, there was two very obvious consequences that have already occurred in the year 2003. So consequences of this combined crisis of the SARS epidemics on one hand and the death of Leslie Chung on the other hand. One occurred almost immediately afterwards, and in May 2003, and that was about some of the largest demonstrations that the city had seen until that moment, and they were caused by a very particular measure that the Hong Kong government was trying to pass ever since the handover in 1997, and basically because of the SARS crisis and the sort of attention that was otherwise completely focused on the epidemics, I think there was an attempt to sneakily pass the measure during that moment when everybody's attention was focusing somewhere else. But this strategy actually backfired. And that was, this measure was known as the Article 23 of the Basic Law, and it was a kind of follow-up to that particular article in Hong Kong's mini constitution known as the Basic Law, and it deals with the internal security law of the internal security situation of the city. So it was a measure that was that if passed would have like severely limited basic freedoms of assembly and also of expression for the city, because it introduced the category of national safety, and it introduced it into the legal system in a way in which positions that would be deemed to be anti-Hong Kong and anti-government could be, and if they would be considered to be threatening to this, they could be penalized. Well, eventually this didn't pass, but unfortunately the events of the last few months in Hong Kong show that even if the law is not in effect, it is in fact being the same effects that would have followed its passing are in fact already in place, and some of the things that, because, to give a concrete example, Macau actually did pass it, unlike Hong Kong, and one of the first measures or one of the first consequences of passing the law was that important Chinese dissidents who tried to enter Macau, I think it was already in 2004, were banned from entering because they would, and without an explanation given. And already this year, when the leaders of the student movement in Taiwan tried to enter Hong Kong, they were also banned from entering. So something that was considered to be otherwise not possible in Hong Kong is already in place. Anyway, the point was that against that measure, there were growing demonstrations that culminated in July of that year with anything between 500,000 and 1.5 million people being on the streets and demanding for this measure to be shelved. Now, we were particularly interested not only in the demonstrations per se and in the effects of the demonstrations, but particularly about the connections between what had happened in March, April of that year, and then later on from May to July, and what is the cause and effect relationship between a crisis of fear of both personal and sort of collective fear of a disease, and this unexpected turn of politicization, especially since Hong Kong up until then was considered to be a very depoliticized society and a city that actually did not have or had a very poor sense of a community, of it being a collective that can activate itself in a political way and to sort of come together and act politically. So let's say the kind of proposition, our proposition for the beginning of the show was that the kind of situation where one is devoid of agency under these conditions of quarantine and of isolation, when one is forced into the most extreme form of individuality, where coming close to one another is actually life-threatening. It's not only discouraged politically, but it's life-threatening because the physical presence of the other could mean death. and I remind you that this was really like a kind of disease that was really not known at that moment, and it wasn't very clear how it's being transmitted. So that kind of extreme situation imposed on an individual backfired, and possibly the best way to sort of like overcome that the devoidal of agency that was forced upon individuals was to actually come together and to sort of like form this political community. Now, the situation was not all rosy and merry, because there was another consequence of that, which of the same landscape of fear during the epidemics, and that had to do with the relationship between Hong Kong and mainland China. Obviously, the epidemics, the way it hit the city, it also produced a sudden and massive economic crisis, almost meltdown, because especially in a city that is whose economy is based so much on real estate, on the stock market, and and basically on all these economies that rely on this very important in capitalism asset of confidence. Confidence that contracts will be honored, confidence that growth is perpetual, confidence in the booming, growing economy. When confidence is lost, and confidence is lost during such a major epidemic, pretty much everything else is lost. So the city was economically in doldrums. So the first measure that was taken by the government to attempt to alleviate this crisis was to allow for the first time mainland Chinese citizens to enter Hong Kong on individual visas. Because, even with the handover having happened in 1997, mainland Chinese citizens could only enter either with special permits, which were very difficult to obtain, or with collective visas for tours and other such options. So it was just after, and as a direct consequence of the SARS crisis, that mainland Chinese citizens were allowed to enter the territory individually. And of course, this is one of the single most important and sort of consequential measure taken in the city in the last decades. Last year, there were 53 million mainland Chinese visitors entering the territory, and of course, this had enormous consequences in terms of economy, in terms of cityscape, and very importantly, in terms of the relationship between these two groups, Hong Kong citizens and mainlanders, and also in terms of one's perception in Hong Kong of one's own identity and relationship to China. So, a bit of a complicated and meandering line of reasoning and of consequences. Now, exactly because of this complicated intellectual structure and the ambiguity of many of the items and of the signs that were created in society and in art around these tensions, it was very clear for us that this is something that needs to be tackled through an exhibition, that this is not a topic that can be left exclusively to the means and tools of journalism and to the means and tools of sociology and historiography, that the number of ambiguities and the number of things that are there but need to be expressed with this kind of double entendre and multiple possibilities that art has at its disposal, and especially curating an exhibition has at its disposal. It was very clear for us that this needs to be expressed with this means, and there needs to be a kind of a curatorial investigation in putting together this this proposition of implications and of stories. And for us, it was also very important to, when doing that, to look at a wider historical picture, to understand how does this occurrence of fear of contagion from a disease relate to the fear of contagion of other people, of other cultures, and to understand it in a historical perspective. And when we did that, we realized that Hong Kong actually has a very important history of this connection. So most of you know that Hong Kong became a British colony in 1841, and as a consequence of the First Opium War, which was also the first confrontation between China and Western powers, and it can easily be considered conventionally as the beginning of the modern era in China as well. So that particular moment, the birth of Hong Kong, has quite important implications for the history of the world, and it certainly has very important implications for the history of China. And if we also look at the moment of handover of Hong Kong in 1997, and we can also easily take that as the end of the very long era of European colonialism, as it was the last major colony of Europe that was coming out of European control. We see that somehow this little city... Yes. I think I said major. So still this little city has this very important kind of position at different crossroads of world history. From the very beginning of the colony, of the British colony in Hong Kong, it also had a very particular status and a very particular image. It was widely considered for the first decades of the colonial era as one of the most unhospitable, infected and sort of disease-prone colonies of the British Empire. Now, this wasn't entirely justified. There were certainly more areas in the British Empire that that were more dangerous and were, statistically speaking, more prone to disease. Nevertheless, there was a very concrete political reason and why this was a very convenient image for Hong Kong. And throughout the 19th century, there was a very important scientific debate that was going on that also had very clear political implications. In many ways, it is similar to the ongoing debate about climate change, which of course has like a scientific basis, but it's also a very strong, it has a very strong political implications and political basis. And sides that are supporting different visions about how world economy and how world politics should be managed have radically different visions about, let's say, the scientific views on this issue, right? Because believing in the sort of in climate change and believing in the need to take measures to stop it has huge economic implications. Equally so, in the 19th century, this debate was about how disease, how epidemics spread, basically. And one camp was believing that basically disease spreads from humans to humans. It wasn't very clear how this happens, and then at the beginning of the 19th century there were a number of fanciful theories for that. Later on, germs and bacteria and viruses were brought into the question, and more accurate explanations were given for this inside this camp, so to speak. Nevertheless, the main idea was that it is people who are spreading disease to other people. And there was another camp that believed that no, disease is actually intrinsic to a place. This was called the miasmatic theory, which believed that there are such things as miasmas in certain places. And again, there were a lot of fanciful explanations about how they come to be. It's about the soil, it's about the angle of the sun, how the sun falls into certain across the mountains and all that, and that's what causes disease. And of course, if you would believe in the first theory, you would also believe that the best way to control epidemics is to impose some form of quarantine and to control the flow of people. And if you would believe that, and if you would do that, it would of course have serious consequences on the free flow of goods and on free trade. And of course, the British Empire was the main beneficiary of free trade in the 19th century. So there was a major political interest in the British Empire to dispel this theory that people spread disease to other people, and they wanted to, they really put their whole weight behind supporting the opposite theory, that there's actually something ingrained in certain places that causes disease. And they somehow found the perfect place, which was Hong Kong. And there were a number of high British officials, both military and civilians, that tried to prove that there's something intrinsically wrong with Hong Kong. And it's particularly bad in spreading miasmas, and it's, disease is prone to affect anyone who comes to Hong Kong. So somehow, again, the territory found itself in the middle of this very elaborate imagery that had a political basis, and which was meant to sort of understand and to offer this explanation about how germs, how disease ultimately affects individuals. This is a painting that we copied, and we showed the copy in the exhibition. It is by George Chinnery, very important British painter who lived both in British India and in Macau for a long time. He has also visited Hong Kong in 1841, 1842, so really at the very beginning of the colony, and he did the first images that are known of the city, of the territory. It wasn't really a city at the time. And this is an image of one of the first Western doctors who was active in China, Dr. Parker. And of course, there are several representations of him in this kind of Napoleonic posture, bringing kind of Western science and knowledge upon the barbarians that are, represented, in a clearly disadvantageous hierarchical position towards him. Now, at the end of the 19th century, a major event occurred that forever placed Hong Kong in a very strong position that associated disease with racism, basically. So in 1894, a plague epidemic, one of the last major plague epidemic in the world, originated in Hong Kong and spread to different parts of the world. It actually it came to Sydney as well, and it was pretty deadly here, and to San Francisco it was also extremely deadly. So over the few years after 1894. It was the last one. It was a very important epidemic. Again, it wasn't of plague. Again, it wasn't incredibly deadly. Its importance comes from another reason. It was during these epidemics that the actual virus that causes, it's not a virus, the bacillus, a bacteria that causes the plague, was identified by a Japanese and a Swiss doctor in Hong Kong. So basically this disease that was one of the major killer of humanity for the past 1,500 years had its origins and its reason identified. And it was identified in Hong Kong. This discovery in 1894 made huge international headlines, actually. So it was really like immediately published by all the newspapers, and it was very much discussed. And immediately this association between this very deadly disease that has a very, very particular cultural profile as well, and especially in Europe, it's really somehow considered as the mother of all epidemic diseases, was immediately associated with Asia and Asians, and Hong Kong in particular. And this came on a very particular cultural background of racism. Because at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, these are images that we also showed in the exhibition in Hong Kong of British soldiers taking measures to sanitize the Chinese quarters where the epidemic started and where it was also discovered. This is basically what came afterwards, with the entire neighborhood being razed. So the epidemics also had like major consequences in terms of urban thinking and in terms of implementing modern architecture, which is ultimately based on this idea of hygiene and this idea of standardizing and of cleansing, you know, the kind of unhygienic and unregulated, you know, older forms of living together. Yeah, but I was saying that I was saying that at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, the spectrum of fear and of hate of the entire Western world was primarily focused on Asians, and it's something that we know as the Yellow Peril. Basically, everywhere from Western Europe, North America, South Africa, and Australia, we actually had some items from Australian newspapers from early 20th century. I couldn't identify which ones are there here, unfortunately, but I think, but one of the three ones from below was published in an Australian newspaper. So basically, the Western world, having known a period of several decades of peace, could not conceive that it could actually get into a position to and believing of itself of having reached a particular moment of civilization and progress, could not believe that a threat to its stability and prosperity could possibly come from inside it, you know, itself, from inside the Western civilization. So the prospect of the Asian multitudes as threatening agents became really the main hysteria in all these places. And it was a very complex fear, because it was based on a very superior sort of like view on the Asians, and this particular form of stereotyping actually used a lot of forms and a lot of the common tropes that are actually still used against China, primarily in many parts of the Western world. You know, that the Chinese are willing to work for a little money, and that they will take the jobs and of the white men, and so on and so forth. The only difference is that, of course, this taking of jobs wouldn't happen through outsourcing, which was not really viable at the time, but would happen through immigration. So through Chinese actually coming to the West and taking these jobs. So this was like one of the specters of racism, and the other one was primarily, having as object Japan was the actual fear of the rising power of the Japanese Empire. Sorry, did I say Japan before Germany? It was Japan, yes. So of Japan actually, rising in power and level of civilization and taking over. So it was a very complex specter of fear. So on this background of racism, having this biological fear, the idea that Asians are also spreading and also somehow behind the cause of the deadliest epidemics that has been hitting the Western world for a long time, was extremely potent and had an amplifying effect. And of course, Hong Kong was at the very core of it. So for us, this was a very interesting moment and a very interesting occurrence, the connection between the two. Primarily because what we would see during 2003 was the same pattern, even if, of course, the level of discourse was much more tamed, and of course, the specter of violence that was very much real 100 years ago was also much more tamed in 2003. And of course, the major difference was that the agents of racism were, primarily Chinese themselves in Hong Kong. So of course, there was a major complication when one had to bring in race into discussion and identity. So these are, various caricatures from various newspapers that, were iconic for this phenomenon of the yellow peril. You see how the different imagery was, how different types of imagery were used to make this point. Now, it's important to say that very often the imagery was biological, that very often different animals were used to make the point that, as part of this, the racist agent is always, it's a dehumanizing machine, that the best way, of course, to make your point is to portray the other as also another biological regnum, to exclude the other from the collective of humanity and to place the other, in whatever inferior category of the biological tree, insects and animals and whatsoever. Here, these are, besides actually showing quite a lot of items related to this yellow pearl, we also worked with Singaporean artist Ming Wang, who actually showed several pieces in the exhibition related to this, to that moment. Below, this is on the top right corner. This is one example from a collection of objects, an archive that he has been building of different objects and items that deal with particular stereotypes on the Chinese community, and as part of that, maybe I show this. As part of that archive, he also has like a massive collection of posters of films, of Hollywood films produced from the beginning of the 20th century up until well in the 80s that portray the Orient, particularly the East Asian form of Orient, in particular stereotypes, like being sneaky, being dangerous, being also demasculinized, and being somehow double-faced. And the second project that he did was a remake of the important Hollywood classic, Chinatown. This is part of his common practice, Ming Wang's common practice he tries to illustrate particular cultural or political or historical, neuroses and moments, and he tries to capture somehow the zeitgeist of a particular place at a particular moment through usually picking a scene or several films of a film that was produced in that era. And what he usually does is that he actually plays every character. And he's incredibly talented at doing that. It's quite a lo-fi production somehow, so it's not about using the most accurate means of deceiving one's own identity, but he's actually very talented of making it very convincingly with, let's say, the classical means of makeup and of acting. So in this film, he's sort of like restaging several chasing scenes. He's playing all the characters: the white, the Asian, the female, the male, the policeman, the bad guys. And there's also the montage is done in such a way that it becomes unclear who's chasing whom, and basically who's who in the entire story. So there's this kind of like neurosis of film noir, of a different era of cinema and of sort of the Western cinematic world, but the roles are inverted significantly. This is another work by Taiwanese artists In Rujan and James T. Hong. It was also important for us to, at every point of the exhibition, to make sure that we're not singularizing any of the episodes that we're mentioning, because, of course, racism is a universal phenomenon, and also the particular manifestations of racism that we're talking about are universal, and particularly this situation and this way of dehumanizing the other that happened both with the Yellow Peril and later on after 2003 is something that can be traced in other places as well. This is a video that the two Taiwanese artists did while living in the States, and it refers to a particular image that was circulating in the 90s of the Mexicans portrayed as ants. And I can't remember who it was. It was, I think, a governor of one state somewhere in I think, like the western part of the U.S. that compared Mexican immigration with ants coming over the state. So they created this very spectacular sort of video of map of America actually being overrun by real ants. Now, this is an infamous ad image, which was an ad in several major Hong Kong newspapers that were actually paid by grassroots Facebook campaigns. So they also have this important weight of having been made possible through really a collective effort. And it was really, it was published two years ago now, so it really, like, at the beginning of the most hysteric phase of the anti-mainland Chinese phase in Hong Kong society, and it also, like, brought very much into the mainstream disassociation of the mainland Chinese as locusts, which is one of the strongest image that is to be found in relationship to this. So again, the kind of, there is a kind of tracing that what one can do of non-human animalic imagery that is actually universal, and it's this was previous 97. Well, this is a work that was actually produced, that we produced in the framework of the show. It was, it also got us a little bit in trouble. so to speak. But so it was, I always work creating a map of China out of baby formula milk powder cans. And of course the milk powder was again one of the key components of this anti-mainland Chinese hysteria. Because, well, as you remember, there was a major scandal in mainland China, I think it was in 2008, where several kids died because of infested milk powder. So after that, there was a loss of confidence, of course, in baby powder that was to be found on Chinese market. So it became common for baby powder to be purchased outside of mainland China, Hong Kong being obviously one of the easiest places for that. So, and one of the most absurd hysterias, well, like any hysteria, I guess, started around baby formula and this idea that somehow, with all the millions of mainland shoppers in Hong Kong, there wouldn't be enough baby powder left for the poor Hong Kong kids. So the crazy thing is that this hysteria actually got political support. So the otherwise very pro-Beijing Hong Kong government nevertheless decided to place a ban and a cap on the amount of baby powder that can be taken out of Hong Kong by individuals in one day. So you're now not allowed to take more than 2 cans of baby powder when you're leaving Hong Kong. Now this is especially crazy when when you understand that this is happening in Hong Kong, which is by most assessment methods considered to be the freest economy in the world, a place where you can take in and out pretty much everything you want. It's one of the only places where you can take in and out as much cash of any currency as you want, no questions asked, and really pretty much everything else without even being taxed. So the idea that you cannot take a third can of milk powder with you is particularly absurd. And when you leave or enter Hong Kong, the 2 most obvious things that you would notice both in the airport if you come by air or in the subway if you come from mainland China is announcement about your health, whether you have fever or you have headaches, and if yes, that you should immediately see a doctor, and then you have the quarantine, and you have the people checking your temperature, and the second one, the warning whether you would be taking that you're not allowed to take more than 2 cans of baby powder, and if so, you would be prosecuted. So with the exhibition, we tried to make some different things. So there is this very strong, let's say, essayistic component, trying to make the points that I try to make here, this connection between instances of fear of contagion and instances of racism, both in a kind of historical perspective, and then trying to bring them to the year 2003, and then there was also the section that specifically dealt with Leslie Chung that I will mention next. But there were several moments when we tried to break this argumentation that was done both through historical materials and with the help of works by several artists. And these different moments of rupture were, I think, well, ultimately the essential moments in the show that justified what I mentioned at the beginning, that this will be an exhibition of art rather than an essay or rather than a journalistic endeavor trying to put all these facts together. And these were moments where a lot of the things we were actually trying to demonstrate got destabilized somehow. And one of these moments was to be found in exhibition, especially after these moments of dehumanization through either stereotyping, through caricaturizing, through reducing individuals to ghosts. We also had, just before that, the beautiful film by Apichatpong Wirastakun, the Thai film director, that was it's a very beautiful film set in an abandoned hotel room with and where you see some feathers at some point and you hear fragments of conversation that you realize that they're basically spoken by ghosts. And that particular hotel has a history in terms of being a place for that housed refugees from Cambodia after the Vietnamese invasion. But it was also interesting for us that it was another form of dehumanizing subjects in a way, of reducing them to ghosts. So what this section of the exhibition tried to do was to somehow find the best way to fight that way of dehumanizing, and to do that through, one of the most direct forms that is available there aesthetically, which is a very particular type of let's say, performance art, where, the artist places one's own body as a tool for, for making a point that is, beyond him or her persona. And we actually, in the show, in Hong Kong, we used 3 artists for that from different contexts, but it also contexts that had something very strong in common, which was that they were all done at moments of great transformation and transition for those contexts. So one was Ma Liuming from China, who did his performances in early to mid 1990s, so in this post 89 environment of Beijing. So he would walk naked through Beijing, but also through the Great Wall of China, and he did several performances. This is actually a still from a performance. He's quite a well-known figure for that. Other artists were less known, so we also showed a very important Hong Kong artist, and one of the most, critical and sort of interesting figures active, well, since the 70s and 80s, Ricky Yearning, who did in 1987, so in kind of in anticipation of the handover, just 10 years before, he did a performance called Man in the Cage, where he locked himself in a cage for 48 hours and smeared himself with blood and did various things. And he's really a kind of unrecognized figure, under-recognized figure in Hong Kong, better put. And also a more recent Mo Sat, a young visual and performance artist from Myanmar. So again, a context that is undergoing very rapid change and transformation now. And they were accompanied with text, actually. So it's a very powerful series of images about, and it's again using very strongly one's own body to make, very clear statements. For the show in Taipei, we already added another work of Joseph Ng, an artist from Singapore, who did a very important and then and performance with a very strong afterlife in '93, which the performance was done actually in a kind of response towards a crackdown towards the gay community in Singapore, and it involved different actions by the artist, the most notorious of which would be him cutting his pubic hair with the back to the audience. And that image was photographed, and then it got into the media, and it produced a huge scandal. And as a consequence of that, unscripted performance art would be banned in Singapore for the next 10 years. So we showed that. And then now actually for the version in Korea, where the exhibition is growing, we're showing several other works as well. We're also showing a work of an artist from Kazakhstan that was active in the 90s, and then again with his own body being placed on stage, but in a very different context, in the context of sort of rising nationalism. So again of the body again being present and being recuperated from stereotyping, but in a way being again abused by becoming an essence for a different kind of nationalism in a kind of post-Soviet era. And then several other queer and female artists would be part of the sort of Korean presentation. Now, this is a work by Taiwanese-German artist that took photographs in the actual in the housing complex that was the most affected during the SARS crisis. It was the Amoy Gardens. Now, what was another subtext of the exhibition was architecture, and particularly modern architecture. And I showed you at the beginning in those documentary images of the plague how the colonial government's response to the crisis, one of the responses was to raise the Chinese neighborhood, which was essentially a slum, and to already like systematize that entire neighborhood. Coincidentally, that's actually the neighborhood where Parasite is located. So, this entire show is actually just an exploration of our neighborhood somehow, because it's really like, 150 meters away. So, modern architecture was, the response that has been given for a long time to disease and to a vision of society that was, there's something in the systematized, order of clean, straight angles and of piping systems that is meant to fight, the disease, that is meant to fight the organic, that is meant to fight the, unregulated flows. So there is, of course, this myth of modern architecture as being sanitized and of being, protective in that sense. Now, the irony makes it that SARS, the most deadly manifestation of SARS in Hong Kong was actually because of a very modern architecture feature. And the largest number of victims were in this housing complex. And they were all infected by the virus circulating through these pipes of the building. So, the work kind of tried to show that. So there was a slideshows of images, showing in full glory the modernist features of this complex, and then there was a voiceover from a fragment from a Le Corbusier text. And we also showed the pipe, an actual pipe that was introduced in Hong Kong after the SARS crisis that again was meant to bring a new technological improvement. How long this will last. So now Hong Kong actually has like different standards of pipes that are not in straight angles anymore, but there's like more ondulation, that is probably meant to make the flow better and less dangerous. And we also showed an Australian artist in the beginning, in the face, Megan Cope. She was shown in the first section of the exhibition, so where we tried to map the kind of the landscape, the colonial landscape of Hong Kong, and the different elements that were used by the British authorities to build its legitimacy in Hong Kong. And we wanted to show this work that I'm sure that most of you are even more familiar than we are, and it's based on this very important declaration of one of the first Australian governors, actually in Sydney. And the work was shown in a very particular, situation, like display situation that showed again all the instruments and the imagery that the British Empire used to deal with its subjects. Okay, so before going to the part about Leslie Chung, I would just want to reiterate, when we talk about consequences, because I mentioned at the beginning that 2003 had a dual set of consequences for Hong Kong. One being this growing tension between mainland China and Hong Kong, and a growing sense of xenophobia and of racism, even in the relationship between the two. But the other effect was a growing politicization of Hong Kong citizenry and a sort of renewed sense of, being part of a collective and being part of a community that has a political purpose. And this duality is not perfect. Like I would not make a clear distinction between, you know, the kind of glorious development of Hong Kong, you know, finally finding its voice and you know, finally becoming you know, an empowered community, which is, you know, nevertheless a very important achievement, and it's an accurate description of what has been going on in Hong Kong in the last 11 years. And those demonstrations of 1st of July. 1st of July is also the actually anniversary of the handover, and there have been pro-democracy demonstrations immediately after '97, but they've really become major events in the calendar of the city after 2003, after the major demonstrations of 1st of July 2003. So this has been a very important component of like what Hong Kong means today, and you know, in the last 3 years, with massively growing tensions between Hong Kong and the central government, these demonstrations are only growing. And you know, last week when for the 1st of July, it was probably the largest since 2003, and some people claim it was even larger than the one in 2003. And these are largely pro-democracy movements. Nevertheless, the borders between the kind of pro-democracy camp and the kind of anti-central government attitude are not completely distinguished from the more general fear of mainland China that has, you know, clear, you know, racist and xenophobic undertones. And I think, you know, particularly this tension and this ambiguity of a lot of discourses is one of the most uncomfortable parts of the current situation in Hong Kong. And I think this is particularly that area of tension and of danger that we try to explore with the show, and that we somehow try to expose for as much as possible. You know, that, you know, within a legitimate political discourse, there's also projections of fear and of hatred that are much more problematic somehow. And then, you know, the exhibition was called A Journal of the Plague Year, which is, of course, the book by Daniel Defoe, which was capturing the plague epidemic that hit London in 1665, a major event for various reasons as well in history of London and Britain. Now, it's very interesting to make the comparison between the two because of several reasons, and it's shocking to see how little certain things change. There is also very interesting quasi-coincidence between the two, and that is that A Journal of the Plague Year, the book, starts with the specter of war, because when the plague was hitting London in 1665, Britain was in a war. England was in a war with the Netherlands. So it was the Anglo-Dutch War, which was quite threatening for Britain because it was quite close to, the enemy was quite close to home, and while there wasn't any invasion, this specter was kind of there that it might actually happen. So there was this fear of war somewhere there, that as the disease progresses and as a much more immediate fear takes over society, the specter of war somehow dissipates. And of course, the SARS crisis was exactly overlapping with the beginning of the US invasion in Iraq. It was really, they both happened in March 2003. And then you could, if you would look at the main page of newspapers in Hong Kong, from the 1st of March to 1st of April, you would see how every day the headline had something to do with the war or with the impending war, with the impending invasion. And then at some point on the bottom of the first page, you see that there's, you know, this strange disease of somebody who was interned in the hospital. And then as the day progresses, the two switch sides, and then the war becomes somewhere, you know, on the second page, and then it's all about SARS. And this was pretty much the case in both situations, but also like the way in which, you know, individuals relate to society, also in terms of like how totally fanciful precautions were used in both cases. Like vinegar was extremely popular in 60-65 in London as something that you would put in a room to protect yourself from the germs, and it was also very much employed in Hong Kong. We actually had 2 bottles of vinegar in the show as well, of Chinese vinegar. But the main reason why we actually chose this title was not so much because of the connection with Daniel Defoe, but because of the method that the journal implies, the curatorial method that it begs for. Because a journal is a very particular type of document. It's one that lists events that have in common primarily the fact of having occurred at the same time. Now, whether these events are connected or not, it's secondary to the purpose. More often they are, because most often events in one's own personal journal are connected to each other. But that's not the primary structure in which they're listed. They're listed simply because of having occurred in the same time frame. This is very much relevant in discussing how the death of Leslie Chung relates to everything that I mentioned before. Now, for every person in Hong Kong, these things are inevitably connected because of their simultaneity. So on the 1st of April, which was really the height of fear towards SARS, it's the day when a false but very credible gossip was circulating that Hong Kong would be completely sealed off by the World Health Organization because the crisis was getting so big. The news also came that Leslie Chung, who was, I will mention later, you know, not just a very important pop star, but in many ways a kind of an image for Hong Kong and a symbol for Hong Kong in many ways, has killed himself and has done so by throwing himself out of the Mandarin Oriental in the center of Hong Kong. This was quite a shocking news. Now, it's very clear that somehow his death has nothing to do with SARS. I mean, it's important to say he was suffering from depression for a long time, so it's very unlikely, although I guess one can never say for sure, but it's very unlikely that his actual decision to commit suicide was triggered by the SARS crisis. Nevertheless, the perception of doom and the perception of tragedy surrounding his death was certainly catalyzed by the overall sense of danger in society, and vice versa. I guess the overall and the individually perceived sense that the world is coming to an end, and that a certain and that the fundamental, you know, stable things about Hong Kong are being threatened, was also very much catalyzed by his death. I think he's definitely now, if we look at his figure now in retrospect, he has become a symbol of an old Hong Kong that is not there anymore, and it's definitely a Hong Kong that was the one, if not pre-handover, like it's a Hong Kong that had a very distinctive identity that was obviously very much so distinctive in relationship to mainland China. So in that sense, you can look at him as the representative of the Hong Kong that changed after 2003. But I think even more accurately is to perceive him as a kind of blank canvas on which the very complicated and shifting identities of Hong Kong of the last 30 years was projected. Because he this stems very much from also from his incredible acting abilities. He has also been somebody who has played very different types of roles. He has been everything from the kind of, you know, just the attractive young man in a film, to the straight man, to the attractive, you know, gay man in the film, to the middle-aged gay man in his last film, to a transsexual in probably the most important film in which he played, Farewell My Concubine, or a transgendered person in Farewell My Concubine. So he had this extreme versatility in the kind of images that he could impersonate. And it's particularly Farewell My Concubine that we showed fragments of in the exhibition, and we tried to make a point of, like, you know, why is this important for us, is that I don't know how many of you have seen the film. I guess many of you. It's obviously one of the most important Chinese films. You know, it's the only Chinese film up until now that got the grand prize at Cannes, the Palme d'Or. It's a very particular film. So it was done in 1993, yes, and there's a very particular situation there, because you have Leslie Chung, who at the time was very much the symbol of, you know, very glamorous and pop Hong Kong, and of a very particular lifestyle that was at that time still very much unavailable in mainland China, of a certain kind of, you know, glamorous, you know, pop lifestyle. Nevertheless, this symbol, you know, plays a character, speaking Mandarin as well, plays a character that is very much embedded in a film that narrates the cultural upheavals and the history of China in the 20th century. So, even if this was certainly not the intention of the directors and certainly not of Leslie Chung, in many ways this film can be considered almost as a kind of, you know, cultural handover, you know, before it actually happened, you know, in a way of merging these two cultural worlds together. So, you know, this figure was very important for us to understand that moment, very much so. Yeah.